My mother-in-law threw my plate on the floor and kicked me out of Thanksgiving dinner for being too poor. 5 years later, she is standing on my porch begging for a piece of bread. The expensive porcelain shattered against the polished hardwood floor, sending pieces of roasted turkey and cranberry sauce flying across the immaculate dining room. The room went completely silent. My husband's entire family froze, their silver forks suspended midair, looking anywhere but at me. Eleanor stood at the head of the long table, her diamond rings catching the warm chandelier light, her face twisted in a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't just tell me to leave. She made sure everyone in that room knew exactly why I didn't belong. She looked down at my simple, store-bought dress and told me that a girl from a trailer park had no business sitting at a table built by generations of old money. My husband, David, just stared down at his lap, refusing to meet my eyes, too terrified of losing his massive inheritance to say a single word in my defense. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, and I didn't make a scene. I carefully stood up from my chair, wiped a stray drop of gravy from my shoe, walked out into the freezing November rain, and never looked back. That night, as I drove away from their massive gated estate with nothing but a broken suitcase and $50 in my bank account, I made a silent promise to myself that I would never allow another human being to make me feel small again. 5 years is a very long time, and a lot can change when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. I poured every single ounce of my heartbreak, my anger, and my sleepless nights into building something of my very own. I started a small business consulting firm from a rented desk in a damp basement, working 20 hours a day, teaching myself the ins and outs of corporate acquisitions, luxury branding, and high-end asset management. While I was quietly and systematically building an empire, Eleanor and her family were busy destroying theirs from the inside out. Without my knowledge, David's father passed away unexpectedly, leaving Eleanor and David in absolute charge of the family's massive real estate portfolio and investment funds. But arrogance is a dangerous blind spot, and they truly believed their wealth was an infinite fountain that would never run dry. David developed a dangerous, unchecked taste for high-stakes underground gambling, trying to prove to the city that he could make his own fortune overnight. At the same time, Eleanor poured millions of dollars into fraudulent offshore investments that promised unrealistic weekly returns. They thought they were completely untouchable, waving away the urgent warnings of their generational accountants, living a life of extreme luxury on borrowed time and heavily leveraged credit. By the 4th year, the cracks in their financial foundation turned into a total, catastrophic collapse. The major banks began foreclosing on their commercial properties, their remaining stocks crashed to zero, and the historic family name they valued more than human decency became completely worthless in the business world. They were forced to sell the grand estate, the very house where I had been humiliated, just to pay off a small fraction of their aggressive creditors. Meanwhile, my consulting firm had grown exponentially into one of the leading corporate restructuring agencies in the state, operating under a private holding company that kept my name entirely out of the public eye. I was no longer the broke, fragile girl they discarded like trash. I was the anonymous, powerful force saving multi-million-dollar businesses from the brink of total bankruptcy. A few weeks ago, my personal secretary brought a new file to my mahogany desk, mentioning a desperate, family-owned entity that was practically begging for a microloan and a management lease just to keep a basic roof over their heads. When I opened the leather folder and saw Eleanor's elegant but shaky signature at the bottom of the page, my heart skipped a beat. But my face remained completely calm. They had absolutely no idea who owned the holding company. To them, my firm was just a faceless corporate savior, a last-ditch effort to escape total public ruin before the harsh winter set in. I quietly approved a small conditional meeting, instructing my senior representatives to handle the tedious paperwork, but I decided to review their final application privately from the comfort of my home. That brings us to this very morning. It was a crisp, chilly autumn day, almost identical to the weather on that horrific Thanksgiving night 5 years ago. I was sitting in the spacious living room of my new home, slowly sipping hot coffee, when the front security monitor chimed, showing an elderly woman walking slowly up my concrete steps. Her coat was thin, noticeably frayed at the cuffs, and she walked with a heavy, exhausted stoop that made her look 20 years older than I remembered. The proud, untouchable matriarch who had once shattered a plate at my feet was now shivering on my front porch, holding a worn manila folder filled with financial documents. I walked to the front door, took a deep, steadying breath, and pulled it open. Eleanor didn't recognize me at first glance. My hair was styled professionally, my posture was commanding, and the tailored clothes I wore belonged to a world she could no longer afford to step into. She began her rehearsed speech, her voice trembling heavily as she begged the owner of the property for just a few minutes to discuss an urgent business proposal. Then she looked up into my eyes, and the words died instantly in her throat. Her jaw dropped, her face turned entirely pale, and the papers in her hand shook so violently that a few sheets fell onto the porch floor. She whispered my name, her voice laced with a mixture of profound shock, deep-seated shame, and utter disbelief. I stood there in the doorway, looking down at her, not with anger, resentment, or malice, but with a calm, quiet peace that only comes from true, hard-earned closure. I didn't throw her out, and I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached down, picked up the fallen papers from the ground, and handed them back to her. Eleanor began to weep openly, apologizing for the past, claiming she was desperate, hungry, and had absolutely nowhere else to turn after David had abandoned her to flee his own mounting debts. She asked if I could ever find it in my heart to give her a second chance, to save her from the cold streets. I looked at the woman who had once tried to destroy my dignity, and I realized that my revenge was already completely finished. I didn't need to hurt her. Life had already taught her the exact lesson she desperately needed. I told her that my company would review her applications strictly based on the numbers, purely as a professional business courtesy, but that her days of looking down on others were officially over. As I gently closed the door and went back to my warm coffee, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the storm that had pushed me out of that toxic dining room 5 years ago. Sometimes, being thrown out of the comfort of someone else's house is the exact catalyst you need to build a beautiful palace of your own.